Hello there. This is a video about The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. I've just finished reading this book. It took around 2 months in total, quite a long time. It is a very long book, quite heavy. Some of the subjects and topics he talks about, he goes into exquisite detail and goes into quite some depth regarding particularities such as the price of silver, the price of gold, the price of other commodities like corn, and how these things have changed over time. And he dwells on these subjects for quite long periods of time. You do need to persevere with this book. It is an investment of time and energy. You might find yourself getting quite bored at various points because some of it seems quite inanimate in a sense, and also quite repetitive. Some of his points, he does seem to repeat himself, and there are common threads which he constantly returns to. But nonetheless, this is a masterpiece. This really, I would consider this certainly in any list of books ever written. This, I would say, must come into the top 30. Any books ever written in the last 5,000 years, I would certainly say this should make a list of the top 30. And certainly if you're considering studying economics or politics or history, I would say that this is a must read. What you will gain from reading this book you'll be transformed. One of the interesting things is how common and how commonly accepted the key ideas and the main points that Adam Smith talks about are. So in chapter 1, one of his key ideas is that the primary cause of prosperity, the primary cause of why some countries are rich and others aren't, is what he calls the division of labour. And what he means is the specialisation of labourers. So he makes an observation in 1776. This book was published in 1776, the same year that the United States declared independence from Great Britain. So it was a very interesting time. Was just at the start of the Industrial Revolution as well, when that really got going in the latter part of the 18th century, and particularly Great Britain and Holland and Western Europe really became so much richer than all of the other parts of the world, and really it was the Industrial Revolution which greatly accelerated those countries to the opulence that Adam Smith talks about in this book. So one of the key ideas is that with the division of labour, what he is referring to, he gives the example of a pin factory, which is quite a boring example, but he observes that what 10 individuals could produce if they were performing all of the tasks required to produce one pin is much less than what those 10 people could produce as a team if they were each focused on one particular task. He says, for example, what 10 individuals could produce if they had to hammer into shape the pins, if they had to elongate the pins, if they had to sharpen the pins, if they had to bore a hole through the pin, if they had to do all of those things, package the pins, they could produce so much less them what could be produced if 10 individuals got together and said, okay, you're going to do A, you're going to do B, you're going to do C, you're going to do D, and if they specialised in one particular task. And that's kind of common sense now, because of course if they're doing the same thing over and over again, they're going to become very good at what they do. They're going to be very efficient, they're going to become experts in that one particular task. And this is a key idea that Adam Smith puts forward in the book. It is part of everyday parlance now. People say, oh, you need to learn a trade. And so you need to learn a trade. What they're in effect saying is what Adam Smith said back in 1776. You need to specialise in one particular thing, get really good at it, and then you can be more productive. People will give you money because you're very good at what you do. And of course that's self-evidently obvious now, but it wasn't so in 1776. What this book is one of the first attempts to really understand and explain economic principles with the same level of rigour that, say, Sir Isaac Newton applied to the laws of physics, the laws of motion and gravity. Adam Smith tries to do with regards to economics. And that's one of the amazing things about this book is, you know, without sounding too pompous, it kind of makes you proud to be human. The mere fact that this book exists, because it took Adam Smith 10 years to write this book, and his generosity to give that much time in the creation of this book. Okay, it's made him a very wealthy man, because this was it was a bestseller in its day. It sold out within months, partly because his first book, and he only wrote 2 books by the way, but his first book was more on philosophy. I think it was called The Causes and Effects of Moral Sentiments, or something like that. Very much intend to read that one as well, particularly as this one was so good, and learned so much from it. Certainly going to read the other of Adam Smith's 2 books. But another key idea that Adam Smith puts forward, kind of obvious now in the year 2023, in an era in which, certainly in Western nations and most other nations in the world, I think it's fair to say the most prosperous parts of the world today, including China, which in the late 80s underwent considerable economic reform in the direction of capitalism. The Deng Xiaoping reforms of the late 1980s is what has led China, for example, and not just China, but the other so-called East Asian tigers, to the level of wealth that is spectacularly so much greater. In the 1960s and 1970s, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea and China, those countries were nowhere near as rich as they are today. And that is a direct consequence of the introduction of what Adam Smith talks about in this book, which is the free market and self-interest. He puts forward the idea that fundamentally it's self-interest that drives economics. He says it is not by the benevolence of the baker, the butcher or the brewer that we should expect our dinner, but to the regards of their own self-interest, but with regards to their own self-interest. So what that means is that they want money. So they're producing those particular goods, the meat, the beer, and the cakes or the bread, because they want money, obviously, because they want to buy certain goods and services from others. Adam Smith says that one of the key defining characteristics of humans, and no other species does this, is barter, is trade. He says no two dogs have ever agreed to trade bones, which is obvious. The dogs would fight over the bones, they wouldn't trade anything. And he says that money is really one of the great inventions of humankind, and he puts it in the same category as writing. The first writing systems having originated in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, the hieroglyphs and the pictures that they used to record history and the things that were taking place in those times. Adam Smith puts the invention of money in the same category, and he doesn't say this explicitly, but the reason for that is that it motivates the application of human energy towards productive ends. So it makes human beings productive. And our idea of GDP, gross domestic product, essentially comes from Adam Smith. What Adam Smith says is that wealth is not measured in gold or silver. That is to say, a country is not rich because it has lots of gold and silver. That was the case, or that was the belief during the mercantilist era in European history. And he talks about Spain being wrong to take an approach which was to maximize the amount of gold coming into their country, in the mistaken belief that that would somehow make them richer. Adam Smith rejects this idea and says it's not how much gold or silver the country has, it's a case of how productive the country is. What it produces for domestic consumption or for export on an annual basis is an accurate measure of how wealthy that country is. And he talks about self-interest and the division of labour as being two essential parts of that process. What he also does, and this is another key idea, a famous idea, is the idea of the invisible hand. Generally speaking, Adam Smith is quite libertarian. He is against government intervention in most cases. He does mention the importance of not having monopolies, because he sees monopolies, that is to say, one company effectively using government, lobbying government, to defend its status as the sole producer of a particular good or service that people need. And generally he's in favour of competition, the free market. The famous idea of the invisible hand, what Adam Smith is talking about there is he's observing that the free market, in its demand for particular goods and services, people want certain things. What that will do is that will lead people to produce those things because they want to be rich, they want to make money, so they will naturally produce, they will naturally move towards supplying that demand. And the effect of that, whilst it's not intentional, is to further the prosperity of the society. So when lots of individuals are doing things out of self-interest, they will inadvertently promote the prosperity of the nation, because they will be producing things for their own good, for their own, what they want, and that will result in a massive proliferation of productivity. That's an important idea that Adam Smith talks about. There are lots of kind of hidden words of wisdom, and really this book is a treasure trove of ideas that will really make you think. For example, he talks about, and he talks widely about a number of different topics. It is specifically about economics, but because economics is so broad in its effects and implications, it does feed into many other different areas. I want to just read you a quote because there are a number of things he says in this book that just make you stop and think. This is one of the key reasons why I would certainly recommend this book to anyone who wishes to understand economics in much greater detail. So, for example, he says here, this is a book about politics more so than economics, but it's an example of how he said something which one of the key reasons why this book is so brilliant is because it's truthful. Many of the ideas are truthful. They actually work in reality. And that's one of the amazing things about this book. So let me read you this quote. So this is from page 708. So he says, "In modern war, the great expense of firearms gives an evident advantage to the nation which can best afford that expense, and consequently to an opulent and civilized over a poor and barbarous nation. In ancient times, the opulent and civilized found it difficult to defend themselves against the poor and barbarous nations. In modern times, the poor and barbarous find it difficult to defend themselves against the opulent and civilized. The invention of firearms, an invention which at first sight appears to be so pernicious, is certainly favourable both to the permanency and to the extension of civilization." So this is a quote which you can agree or disagree, but reading that, it's more possible to understand the mindset and the logic of the founding fathers of the United States, because today we see guns and firearms as being a tool of violence, essentially. But Adam Smith here is saying that that's not necessarily the case. That it is possible that civilized nations can use firearms to further the aims of civilization. And you can have an opinion on that, your own opinion. But it's just interesting to understand this perspective, because it can be quite difficult to understand some of the arguments you hear from those in the States, for example, that favour the Second Amendment. But those little ideas which Adam Smith discusses, just enables you to consider the other perspective, or to at least consider the other perspective. There were some other quotes I wanted to give you, just to possibly give you a flavour of what Adam Smith is talking about. I did highlight a few examples. Let me just see if I can find any other quotes. I don't think there are anything that immediately stands out. Um, he talks about the differences between towns and the countryside. You have to remember that in the 1800s, not everyone lived in a town or a city, and in England, lots of people worked on land, they lived in the countryside. So in talking about urbanisation, he sees that really as synonymous with specialisation. So he says, a regulation which obliges all those of the same trade in a particular town to enter their names and places of abode in a public register facilitates such assemblies. It connects individuals who might never otherwise be known to one another and gives every man of the trade a direction where to find every other man of it. A regulation which enables those of the same trade to tax themselves in order to provide for their poor, their sick, their widows and orphans, by giving them a common interest to manage, renders such assemblies necessary. So what he's talking about here is people coming together out of a common interest to enriching themselves, and this can be seen in the creation of companies, which are an essential part of capitalist society. Interestingly, this book has received quite a bit of criticism for perhaps being too sort of right-wing, and in effect, some people that are against capitalism, or naked capitalism, you could say that, oh, it's a promotion of self-interest, and doesn't really talk about how inequality, for example, can be lessened, and therefore this book promotes kind of exploitation and the idea that men should be sort of cogs in a wheel, just hamsters on a treadmill, and their value can only be what they're able to produce with their labour, and of course many on the left regard that as a destructive tendency. I think many people would be quite surprised. Adam Smith doesn't recommend that kind of world where people are only just machines that are to be used by companies and corporations. He does, for example, say that what this type of system can do is make people very ignorant and not very educated, because in focusing on just one particular thing and doing that one particular thing for a certain company, they don't spend their time in understanding new things, in learning new things and heightening their consciousness. They're just kind of like robots doing one particular thing. He also says that no country can be considered truly prosperous whilst the majority of it, these aren't the exact words, but I'm giving you an approximation of what he said. No country can be considered truly prosperous whilst the majority of the people are poor and unhappy. Again, it's quite a seemingly left-wing sentiment, but he does talk about fairness. He also advocates a progressive tax system as well. He says that the rich should contribute more to the public purse because they have been afforded certain luxuries and advantages, so they should be expected to pay more into the coffers of the society because they can afford to. There are lots of things in here which speak to common sense and both sides of the political spectrum, really. Those are the main ideas which I've given you. the idea of the division of labour, he also talks about the production of woolen coats. So if you just consider, a woolen coat, and think about the number of different tasks that need to be performed in order to produce a woolen coat. The shepherd, the dryer, the scribbler, the spinner, the comber, the weaver, the dresser, and so on. There's lots of different things there that are required. And of course, in his day, in 1776, there were machines, but they were quite limited in scope. So he talks about the use of hands, hands actually doing this work. Of course, in the Industrial Revolution, I'll just quickly finish off. One of the key ideas is that machines become very available in the latter part of the 19th century, and the Industrial Revolution, really what characterises it is invention, the constant invention of new machines which are able to do much of this labour much more efficiently. So that's quite important. So generally he's a libertarian, as I've already mentioned. He's against governmental interference. He sees it more or less as an obstruction of the invisible hand working to meet the demands that people have, and the free competition which causes the constant betterment not only of the goods and services, but the means of producing those goods and services. So I thought I would just leave you with that today. As I've said, it will take you a long time to read this book, but I would certainly recommend persevering, because what you will gain certainly makes it worthwhile.